What if catching a killer meant letting another monster inside your mind? Before The Silence of the Lambs became one of the only films in history to sweep the Oscars' Big Five, it was a novel that quietly redefined what a psychological thriller could be. Written by Thomas Harris, this book didn't just tell a story about serial killers, it invited you into their psychology. And once you accepted the invitation by opening the book, it made it difficult to escape from it. Before you read it, before you buy it, find out if it's worth your time and money. Today we're breaking down why this novel has sold over 10 million copies, won major awards, and continues to be disturbingly relevant decades later. But more importantly, we're answering the question you actually care about. Is it worth my time? Let's set the stage. The Silence of the Lambs sits at the center of Harris's Hannibal Lecter series, and it's easily the most iconic installment. It climbed the New York Times bestseller list shortly after release, won both the Bram Stoker Award and the Anthony Award, and has been consistently recognized as one of the greatest thrillers ever written. Critically, this book helped pioneer something we now take for granted: deep psychological profiling in crime fiction. Instead of just asking who the killer is, Harris asks something far more unsettling: why? And that why is where this book becomes something deeper than a typical crime story. Because underneath the murders, the investigations, and the horror, this is a story about transformation. Here's how this works. I'm going to walk you through the first quarter of the book in detail, so you can really understand the setup, the characters, and where the story is headed. Then I'll shift into a broader synopsis of the remaining 3/4 of the story, keeping that part spoiler-free so you can decide if it's something you want to experience for yourself. We enter the story through Clarice Starling, an FBI trainee navigating the behavioral science unit, a world dominated by men, hierarchy, and quiet condescension. This matters, because from the very beginning, Harris positions Clarice not just as an investigator, but as someone trying to become something more than what the world expects her to be. And that theme, transformation, threads through every character in this story. Clarice Starling, competence versus perception. Clarice's introduction is deceptively simple. She's capable, disciplined, and sharp. But Harris immediately surrounds her with subtle resistance: male colleagues who underestimate her, authority figures who test her, and an institutional culture that forces her to constantly prove her worth. This creates a dual tension: external, solving the case; internal, proving she belongs. And that internal pressure becomes just as important as the investigation itself. The first encounter with Hannibal Lecter. Then comes one of the most iconic scenes in modern literature. Clarice meets Hannibal Lecter. What makes this scene extraordinary isn't what happens, it's how it happens. There's no violence, no chaos, just conversation. Harris builds tension through precise sensory detail, controlled pacing, razor-sharp dialogue. Lecter immediately establishes dominance, not physically, but psychologically. He reads Clarice with unsettling accuracy, dissecting her background, her accent, even her insecurities. And then he introduces the core rule of their relationship: quid pro quo, information in exchange for personal truth. This transforms the investigation into something far more dangerous: a psychological negotiation where Clarice herself becomes part of the game. Buffalo Bill and the horror of transformation. While Clarice and Lecter engage in intellectual combat, Harris intercuts with glimpses of another figure, Buffalo Bill. These early scenes are fragmented, almost clinical, but deeply disturbing. What stands out isn't just the violence, it's the symbolism. The skinning of victims, the obsession with the death's head moth, the fixation on transformation. Buffalo Bill doesn't just kill, he's trying to become something else. And this is where the novel's central metaphor begins to crystallize. Transformation isn't just a theme, it's the engine of the horror. Narrative structure and pacing. Harris structures the first quarter like a tightening spiral. He alternates between FBI procedural work, Lecter's psychological games, Buffalo Bill's disturbing rituals. This creates a rhythm. Investigation gives you clarity. The killer's perspective takes it away. The result is a constant sense of unease. You're always learning, but never enough to feel safe. Psychological stakes and Clarice's past. Then Harris introduces something crucial: Clarice's childhood trauma, the screaming lambs. This isn't just backstory. It reframes everything. Clarice isn't just trying to save victims. She's trying to silence something inside herself. And Lecter sees that immediately. Which is why their conversations feel so dangerous, because he's not just helping her solve a case, he's unraveling her identity. From this point forward, I'm not going to get into any spoilers, but I will give you a clear sense of where the story goes and what it explores. As the story progresses, everything intensifies, but not in the way you might expect. The Lecter-Clarice dynamic deepens. Their relationship evolves into something uniquely unsettling. It's not quite mentorship, not quite manipulation, not quite adversarial. It's all of them at once. Lecter forces Clarice to confront increasingly personal truths, turning each interaction into a psychological transaction. And here's what makes it brilliant. The closer she gets to solving the case, the more she exposes herself. The investigation expands. The FBI's pursuit of Buffalo Bill becomes more urgent, more complex. We see autopsies, field investigations, behavioral profiling. Harris leans heavily into procedural realism, but never lets it feel dry. Every detail serves tension. Every clue raises new questions. Escalation without release. The stakes rise steadily. New victims, increased political pressure, tightening timelines. But Harris avoids easy payoffs. Instead of sudden shocks, he builds a slow, suffocating dread. You feel like something terrible is coming, but you're never quite sure when or how. Transformation is the core theme. By this point, the theme of transformation becomes impossible to ignore. Buffalo Bill seeks physical transformation. Clarice seeks personal transformation. Lecter manipulates psychological transformation. Each character reflects a different version of the same idea. What does it mean to become someone else? And more importantly, what does it cost? Narrative mechanics and suspense. Harris uses shifting perspectives, misdirection, strategic withholding of information. This keeps you constantly off balance. Even when you think you understand the direction of the story, it shifts just enough to keep you uncertain. Let's bring it all together. The lambs. They represent innocence, but also unresolved trauma. Clarice's need to save the lambs is really a need to resolve her past. The moths. Classic symbol of metamorphosis. But here it's twisted. Transformation isn't beautiful. It's obsessive, distorted, and dangerous. Skin and identity. Skin becomes a literal and symbolic boundary. Who you are, who you appear to be, who you want to become. And Harris constantly blurs those lines. Power and gender. Clarice's journey is also about navigating power in a male-dominated world. Her intelligence is constantly tested, but never fully trusted, which makes her eventual agency feel earned, not given. Book versus film. If you've seen the film adaptation, you already know it's exceptional. It was one of the most profitable movies of its kind and won 5 Academy Awards. But here's the key difference. The film shows you the horror. The book makes you think it. The novel dives deeper into Clarice's internal struggles, Lecter's psychological complexity, the thematic layers of transformation. The movie is unforgettable, but the book is more intimate and more unsettling. Final verdict. So, is The Silence of the Lambs worth your time and money? For me, it absolutely was. But it is worth yours. Well, I have a few important caveats. You'll love this book if you enjoy psychological thrillers with depth. You're interested in character-driven stories. You like slow-burn tension and procedural detail. You want something intellectually engaging, not just entertaining. You might not enjoy it if you're sensitive to disturbing imagery. You dislike themes involving violence or body horror. You're uncomfortable with elements in how gender identity is portrayed. That said, this is also where the book's power truly reveals itself. For me, the disturbing imagery wasn't just there for shock value. It was immersive. Harris's descriptions are so precise, so controlled, that they don't feel exaggerated or theatrical. They feel real. As I read, I wasn't just observing the investigation. I felt like I was experiencing it alongside Clarice, step by step, discovery by discovery. That level of realism doesn't come from graphic detail alone. It comes from how deeply the author understands the psychology behind what you're seeing. And that's what makes it effective. The themes of violence and body horror are undeniably difficult to process. There are moments that are uncomfortable, even unsettling. But those elements are not random. They serve a purpose. They reinforce the central theme of transformation in a way that's impossible to ignore. They force you to confront the darker aspects of the story rather than distance yourself from them. And because of that, the book doesn't fade. It stays with you. Years later, I still find myself thinking about certain scenes, certain conversations, certain psychological exchanges. Not because they were shocking, but because they felt meaningful, intentional, and disturbingly plausible. That's the trade-off this book offers. It asks you to sit with discomfort, in exchange for an experience that is far more vivid, far more immersive, and far more unforgettable than most thrillers ever achieve.